After a devastating accident that left him confined to a wheelchair and completely blind, a millionaire businessman lived isolated in his own mansion while his wife quietly took full control of his million-dollar empire. When a new cleaner was hired, she brought along something unexpected, her 6-year-old daughter, who began playing innocently near him every day. The girl, with her natural curiosity and pure affection, noticed something very strange in his eyes. And what happens next is unbelievable. The scent of lemon pledge and the distant echo of a vacuum cleaner were Arthur's clock. They marked the start of another lightless morning, a day identical to all the others since he'd woken from the coma. Seated in his soft leather wheelchair, facing the study window he could no longer see, he felt the morning sun warm his face, a phantom caress from a world that had been stolen from him. His vast fortune, built with a keen eye for business and a natural talent for turning small capital into an empire, now seemed like a cruel joke. What good was possessing an incalculable net worth, with stocks climbing on the Dow and investments yielding generous dividends, if he couldn't even tell day from night? Darkness was his new business partner, a silent and tyrannical one. "Good morning, my love." The voice of Isabel, his wife, was like silk, a soft sound that had become the pillar of his restricted universe. She drew near, and her expensive perfume, a floral and sweet blend, momentarily overpowered the smell of cleaning supplies. Her hands, always cool and delicate, cupped his face. "Did you sleep well?" Arthur forced a smile. "Like a stone, darling. Thank you for taking care of me." The gratitude was real, but beneath it, a current of unease grew stronger each day. It was a strange feeling, a shapeless distrust he didn't dare to name. Isabel was his rock, his guide in this dark labyrinth. She read him the Wall Street Journal, described the colors of the flowers she placed on his desk, and, most importantly, managed his entire financial empire. "Don't you worry about business," she would say. "Just focus on getting better. Time for your eye drops," she announced softly, the small bottle already in her hand. The routine was immutable. Every morning and every night, the ophthalmologist, an old friend of Isabel's, had said the drops helped keep his eyes hydrated and prevent infections, a common complication in cases of traumatic blindness like his. Arthur tilted his head back, resigned. He felt the cold tip of the dropper hover over his eye, followed by the liquid, icy sting. He blinked, feeling a momentary film form before it dissipated into his perpetual darkness. As Isabel put the bottle away, the mansion's doorbell chimed, a sound that broke the monotony of the silence. "That must be the new housekeeper," Isabel said with a subtle sigh of irritation. "The agency finally sent someone." "Wait here, darling. I'll be quick." Her elegant footsteps receded down the marble hallway. Arthur was left alone with his thoughts, the sound of his own heart beating in his ears. He heard the front door open and Isabel's voice, now firmer and more authoritative, giving instructions. And then, between his wife's words, he heard another sound, a sound he hadn't heard within these walls for months. It was light, crystalline, and full of a joy that seemed almost profane in this austere environment. A child's laugh. The sound was quickly muffled, as if a hand had been placed over a small mouth. But Arthur had heard it. His entire body tensed in the chair. A child. Isabel hadn't mentioned the new employee was bringing a child. His wife had always been fiercely protective of his space, his tranquility. Isabel returned to the study, her perfume preceding her. All set, a woman named Sophia. She seems competent. Unfortunately, she had to bring her daughter, a little girl. "Don't worry, my love. I made it perfectly clear they are to stay in the service areas and not to disturb you in any way." Arthur remained silent, his face turned to the window, but his hearing was now sharp, tuned beyond Isabel's voice, beyond the hum of the central air. He was trying to catch that sound again, that tiny spark of life in a world that had become grey and mute. Something inside him, an old businessman's instinct that had always relied on intuition, stirred. Why did Isabel seem so determined to keep that child away from him? What was it about an innocent girl's laugh that could threaten the perfect, controlled order of his gilded cage? The days that followed became a routine within the routine. In the morning, Isabel's arrival with her perfume and his eye drops. In the afternoon, the soft, distant sounds of Sophia and her daughter, Leah. Isabel had been categorical. Mother and daughter were to remain invisible and inaudible, ghosts hired to maintain the mansion's immaculate order. But sound has its own way of traveling, of seeping through the cracks under doors and down long hallways. Arthur, in his forced stillness, became a master of hearing. He learned to distinguish the gentle sweep of Sophia's broom from the sound of Leah's small feet trying to tiptoe across the cold marble. Occasionally, he'd hear a whispered song, Leah's voice humming a nursery rhyme, a sound so pure and alive it felt like a flower blooming through concrete. He yearned for these small sounds. They were his only connection to a world not orchestrated by Isabel, a world that didn't smell of disinfectant and expensive perfume. Arthur spent hours imagining the little girl's face, the color of her hair, the sparkle in her eyes. His curiosity was a hunger, a desperate need for something real. His vast fortune, which could buy him anything he wanted, couldn't purchase the simple sight of a child's smile. Every stock transaction, every profit report Isabel read to him in her monotone voice only reinforced his powerlessness. The money was a sleeping giant, powerful but useless to its captive owner. One afternoon, the silence was broken unexpectedly. Arthur was in his study as usual, listening to an audiobook on economic history, when the door creaked open. He expected Isabel's footsteps, but these were different, lighter and more hesitant. They were Sophia's. "Excuse me, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice low and respectful. "Mrs. Vance asked me to dust the books on the top shelf. I promised not to disturb you." He heard a step stool being moved and the sound of a cloth sliding over leather-bound spines. And then he heard the sound his heart had been waiting for, Leah's whisper. "Mommy, why does the man always stare at the window? Doesn't he like looking at people?" Arthur's heart leaped. The question was so direct, so devoid of artifice. "Shh, sweetie. Mr. Vance is resting," Sophia gently chided. "We can't bother him. Remember what Mrs. Vance said." Isabel. The name hung in the air like a command. Arthur felt a surge of frustration. He wanted to turn his head, to say, "No, little girl, you don't bother me." Quite the opposite. But his dependence, his vulnerability, kept him a prisoner in his own chair, in his own silence. He was a billionaire whose trade still moved the market, but who had no authority to speak to a child in his own home. There was a moment of silence, and Arthur thought they had moved away. But then he sensed a tiny presence near his wheelchair. It was a hesitation in the air, a small disturbance in the space around him. His body went rigid. He could feel the warmth of a small body near his knee. He heard a soft, almost inaudible breath. The girl was there, observing him, breaking all of Isabel's rules. He waited for Sophia to pull her away, but nothing happened. Suddenly, a child's voice, clear as a bell, cut through the study's stillness. It wasn't a question for her mother, it was for him. "Mr. Leah said, her voice so close Arthur felt a chill. "You have a little something in your eye. It looks like a speck of dust. Why doesn't anybody take it out?" The girl's words hung in the dense air of the study, so simple and yet so cataclysmic. A speck of dust. Arthur felt the blood run cold in his veins. For months, the best specialists, recommended by Isabel, had given him complex diagnoses and grim prognoses: optic nerve damage, irreversible brain trauma. No one, in any of the long, discouraging consultations, had mentioned something so trivial, so physical, as a speck of dust. A buzzing started in his head, the seed of an impossible doubt. What if "Leah, I am so sorry, Mr. Vance. She's just a child. She doesn't know what she's saying." Sophia's voice was a terrified whisper. He heard the rustle of her uniform being tugged and the girl's soft protest. "But Mommy, it's right there, I can see it." Sophia's panic was palpable, a scent of fear that mixed with the lemon pledge. She was about to drag her daughter out, to extinguish this spark of hope before it could ignite his darkness. A survival instinct, the same one that had made him a multimillionaire before he was 40, screamed inside him. He had to act. "Wait," Arthur said. His own voice sounded strange to him, like a rusty hinge on a long-shut door. It wasn't the passive, resigned tone he used with Isabel. It was a command. Sophia stopped instantly. The ensuing silence was heavy, charged with expectation. Arthur slowly turned his head in the direction of the girl's voice, his heart hammering against his ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. "Little girl," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Und come closer." He heard Sophia's sharp intake of breath, but she said nothing. He again felt that small, warm presence beside his chair. She smelled of baby soap and innocence. "Show me," he whispered. "Show me where the speck of dust is." He leaned his head forward, an act of blind, desperate faith. He felt Leah's breath on his face, warm and sweet. Then he felt the lightest, gentlest touch he had ever known. The tip of a tiny finger, hesitant but determined, touched his lower right eyelid, pulling it gently down. There was an almost imperceptible sensation, like an eyelash being brushed away. The finger moved away. "Now the other one," the little voice said, with the seriousness of a surgeon. The same delicate touch on his left eye, the same fleeting sensation. "There," Leah announced, proud. "I got them both. Now there's nothing bothering you anymore." Arthur remained motionless for a second. His heart stopped. Nothing. The same darkness. The disappointment was a physical blow, stealing his breath. It was just a child's fantasy. He opened his mouth to thank her, to dismiss them kindly, but as he blinked, something changed. The blackness was no longer absolute. There was grey, a fog. He blinked again, hard. The fog began to swirl, to separate. Patches of light and shadow began to form, like an old photograph developing in a tray of chemicals. He blinked a third time, and the world exploded. Color. The first thing he registered was color, the deep red of the Persian rug, the emerald green of the plant in the corner, the gold of the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny diamonds. It was overwhelming, painful, and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His mahogany desk, with its dark grain, gleamed. His books, which for months had been just shapeless objects, were now a wall of vibrant colors. He looked down at his own papers, the asset and liability reports that represented his vast estate, and for the first time he could see the numbers, the black letters on the white paper. Slowly, he lowered his gaze, and he saw her. A little girl in a yellow dress, with a pink bow in her dark hair and enormous brown eyes full of pure curiosity, looking up at him with the smile of someone who had just performed a great feat. She was an angel, his angel. A tear ran down his face. He could see the miracle was real, but at the exact moment that pure joy flooded him, a sound from the hallway cut through the air like a blade of ice. The familiar click of Isabel's heels on the marble. She was coming back. He looked at the door, the sound growing closer, the sound of the doorknob beginning to turn. Panic was a cold lightning bolt that shot through the incandescent joy. Isabel, if she saw him, if she saw that he could see, a primal instinct, born of months of vulnerability and a growing distrust, screamed a single command at him: hide. But how do you hide sight? With an effort of will that cost him more than any deal on the stock market, Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, turning the explosion of color back into familiar darkness. He turned his face to the window, his usual position, his blind man's disguise. His body was trembling, but he forced his muscles to relax, to adopt the posture of resignation Isabel knew so well. The door opened. "Arthur, darling, is everything all right?" I heard voices. Isabel's voice was as smooth as ever, but now, to Arthur, it sounded different. There was a metallic edge beneath the silk. He took a deep breath before answering, fighting to keep his voice neutral. "Yes, Isabel, Mrs. Sophia was just finishing up." He didn't mention the girl. He left her out deliberately, an instinctive act of protection. "Ah, of course." Isabel entered the study. Arthur, with his eyes closed, could trace her path by the sound of her steps and the subtle shift in the air as she passed him. She stopped near the desk. "Sophia, you may go now, and take the girl with you. Remember what we discussed about maintaining discretion." The order was given with a sharp coolness. Arthur heard Sophia's hurried whisper and the sound of small, quick footsteps retreating, followed by the soft click of the door closing. They were safe, for now. "Do you need anything, my love?" Isabel asked, her hand landing on his shoulder. The touch, once comforting, now felt like the weight of a chain. "No, darling, just a glass of water if you don't mind." His throat was dry, the words coming out with difficulty. He needed time. He needed to think. What were those specks of dust? How could they have stolen his sight for so long? And why? The question echoed in his brain, terrifying and inescapable. While Isabel left to get the water, Arthur risked opening his eyes for a split second. The world was still there, vibrant and real. He glanced at his desk and saw the small bottle of eye drops Isabel had left there that morning. The same bottle she used every day. A terrible suspicion, so monstrous he barely dared to give it form, began to crawl from the back of his mind. When Isabel returned with the glass of water, he had his eyes closed again. She helped him drink, her hand guiding the glass to his lips. The gesture was intimate, caring, but Arthur felt like a traitor. He was deceiving her, or was she deceiving him? That night, lying in the self-imposed darkness of his room, he couldn't sleep. His mind, once occupied with investment strategies and market analysis, now raced through a labyrinth of fear and confusion. Every touch from Isabel, every kind word, was now examined under a new light. He remembered how she had insisted on hiring her own ophthalmologist, dismissing the hospital's doctors. He remembered how she managed every detail of his life, from his meals to his finances, always under the pretext of taking care of him. The control he once saw as devotion now seemed like something more sinister. His inheritance, his fortune, his net worth, it was all in her hands. The next day, the routine began again. Isabel entered his room with a smile and the little bottle. "Time for your drops, my love." Arthur tilted his head back, his heart pounding. When he felt the cold drop hit his right eye, he fought the instinct to pull away. The familiar sting, the film forming, but this time he was aware. He felt it, a thin, almost unnoticeable layer coating his cornea. His vision, which had been clear when he woke up, began to blur, to turn into that grey fog he knew so well. Within minutes, the vibrant world of color faded into his familiar prison of darkness. The truth hit him with the force of a punch. It wasn't blindness. It was sabotage. His blindness wasn't a condition, it was a daily application. And the person he loved and trusted most was his jailer. The revelation wasn't a scream, but a cold silence that settled deep in Arthur's soul. He wasn't blind. He was being blinded. Daily, methodically, by the woman who slept beside him, the woman to whom he had entrusted not only his heart, but also total control of his assets, his empire, his life. The scale of the betrayal was so vast, his mind struggled to comprehend it. Every gesture of affection, every word of comfort from the past few months, twisted into a venomous lie. His vulnerability hadn't been a misfortune, it had been a weapon used against him. A cold, calculating anger began to replace the shock. It was the same focused rage he felt when a competitor attempted a hostile takeover of his business. It was the instinct of a predator, long dormant, reawakening. He couldn't confront her, not yet. To do so now would be a rookie mistake, a rash move that would cost him everything. If she was capable of chemically blinding him, what else was she capable of? He was a man in a wheelchair, dependent on her for everything. Accusing her without proof, without a plan, would be suicide. He needed a strategy. He needed information. He needed to become the actor of his lifetime. And so, he made the hardest, most dangerous decision he had ever made. He would continue to be the blind, helpless husband. He would pretend, he would watch, he would wait. His home, once his prison, had become his battlefield. The man who once listened passively now listened with a ferocious intensity. Every phone call Isabel took, every visitor she received, became a piece of a puzzle he needed to assemble. He started noticing things that had previously escaped him. The frequency with which Isabel spoke to her financial advisor, a man named Richard, whose oily voice Arthur despised. The conversations were always hushed, filled with terms like asset liquidation, fund transfers, and portfolio optimization. Isabel always told him they were just routine adjustments to protect his estate during his incapacitation. Now, those words sounded like alarm bells. His only window to the world, his only ally, was little Leah. Her daily arrival with her mother was the highlight of his day. The self-imposed blindness became harder and harder to bear, especially when he heard the girls' laughter in the hall. He needed a way to counteract the eye drops. One morning, as Isabel brought him breakfast, he accidentally knocked over his glass of orange juice, drenching his shirt. "Oh, my love, how clumsy," Isabel said, a hint of impatience in her voice. "But let me get a towel." The moment she left the room, Arthur acted. With a speed that would have stunned anyone watching, he tilted his head to the side and, using his thumb, pressed firmly on the inner corner of his eye, forcing most of the eye drop to drain down his face before it could be fully absorbed. He did the same with the other eye. It was a risky, imperfect maneuver, but maybe it would be enough. When Isabel returned, he was dabbing at his face with a napkin. "I think some juice got in my eyes," he lied. The result wasn't immediate. His vision remained blurry for nearly an hour, but gradually, like the sun burning through morning fog, shapes began to solidify. The colors, though washed out, returned. It wasn't the perfect clarity he'd experienced with Leah, but it was enough. He could see. Later that day, sitting in his study, he heard Isabel on the phone in the hallway. The door was ajar, feigning sleep. He tilted his head, sharpening his hearing, and, for the first time, his vision. He could see her, her back to him, pacing. "Yes, Richard, I know the deadline is approaching," she was saying, her voice low and tense. "But we have to be careful. He can't suspect a thing. No, not yet. The main transfer can only happen after we have the final power of attorney. Yes. The doctor is already preparing the final report on his permanent incapacity. Though, we need to accelerate things, make sure everything is ready on your end. We have to ensure that when the time comes, nothing can be reversed. Accelerate things. Permanent incapacity. Nothing can be reversed." The words echoed in Arthur's mind. Isabel's plan was far bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just about controlling his money. It was about stripping him of everything, permanently. Of legally erasing him, turning him into a wealthy ghost whose fortune she could spend freely. His wife wasn't just a thief. She was a predator preparing for the final kill, and he was watching from his wheelchair, the silent witness to his own financial execution. The revelation of Isabel's plan solidified the ice in Arthur's veins. The rage gave way to a cold, sharp determination. He was at war, and his study was his trench. His greatest challenge, however, wasn't Isabel, but his growing affection for Sophia and especially for Leah. The girl, with her radiant innocence, had become his lighthouse. He longed for the moments when she would sneak into the study while her mother cleaned, to show him a drawing or tell him a secret about her doll. In those brief moments, he would risk blinking his eyes open, absorbing the image of her smile, memorizing the light in her eyes. She was his dose of truth in a world of lies. Isabel, however, was not blind. Her sharp perception, which Arthur had once admired, was now a constant threat. She began to notice how often the girl approached him. "That child is becoming far too bold," Isabel commented one evening as she administered his drops. "She's always hovering around your study. I don't want your peace disturbed." Arthur felt a chill. "She's just a little girl, Isabel. She doesn't bother me." "Perhaps not," she replied, her soft tone masking a warning. "But discipline is important. Her mother seems far too permissive." The following days proved Isabel's words were more than a simple comment. Little incidents began to occur. One morning, a small, priceless Ming Dynasty vase, which had been in Arthur's family for generations, was found shattered on the living room floor. Isabel, with a look of profound sadness, called Sophia in. "Sophia, I don't want to believe this," she said, her voice trembling with rehearsed sorrow. "This vase was invaluable. The only person in this room today was you and your daughter." "But Mrs. Vance, I swear," Sophia protested, her face pale with shock. "We didn't even touch it. Leah was with me in the kitchen the whole time." Arthur, listening from his study, felt his stomach turn. He knew, with absolute certainty, it was a setup. Isabel was building a case against them. He wanted to scream, to intervene, but that would reveal his game. He was trapped, forced to watch as his only ally was cornered. The second incident came more directly. Isabel began to be more vigilant with the application of the eye drops. Sometimes, she would enter his room in the middle of the afternoon with the bottle. "The doctor recommended an extra dose," she'd say, "just to ensure your eyes stay well lubricated." This drastically limited his windows of sight. The moments of clarity became shorter and riskier. He had to be more careful with his drainage maneuver, faster. The strain of maintaining the charade was exhausting him physically and mentally. He felt like a spy in his own life, and every day was a high-stakes gamble. His vast capital, which continued to grow in accounts he no longer controlled, was the prize in this dangerous game. Despite Isabel's vigilance, the bond between Arthur and Leah deepened. The girl seemed to sense his loneliness and offered him her company without reservation. One morning, while Isabel was on a long call with her lawyer, Leah tiptoed into the study. She didn't speak. She just sat on the rug near his feet and began playing with her dolls, creating a fantasy world in whispers. Arthur watched her through the haze that had not yet fully dissipated. He saw her stop playing and look up at him, her head tilted. Then she glanced at the door, as if checking if anyone was coming. She stood up and came closer, a finger to her lips in a gesture of secrecy. "Mister," she whispered, pointing to the small table beside Isabel's armchair. "The mean lady was putting more of those drops in your eye when you were napping. I saw her." Arthur's heart stopped. The girl had seen. She had noticed Isabel's furtive gesture, an act his wife performed, thinking she was completely alone. Leah didn't understand the meaning of what she'd seen, but her innocent observation was the first piece of external proof he had. It was confirmation that he wasn't going mad. Just then, they heard footsteps in the hall. Leah jumped, startled, and scurried behind the heavy drapes, hiding just in time for Isabel to enter the study. Still napping, "My love?" she asked, her voice a dangerous purr. She came over and ran a hand through his hair. "It's for the best. Get plenty of rest. We have a very busy week ahead of us." Arthur remained motionless, his heart pounding against his ribs. Behind the curtain, he knew a pair of frightened, childish eyes were watching. The war had just gained a new dimension. It was no longer just about his fortune or his freedom. It was about protecting the innocent child who had become his unwitting witness. Isabel's busy week began on Tuesday. Arthur felt the shift in the house's atmosphere. There was a current of tense energy, a hum of activity that seeped into the usual silence. Isabel spent more time on the phone, her conversations now fragmented into code and half-words. She was moving the pieces on the board, and he was the immobilized king, awaiting checkmate. His only hope lay in his ability to remain invisible in plain sight, to be the most expensive, ignored piece of furniture in his own study. He had perfected his technique for expelling the eye drops, now managing longer periods of blurry but functional vision. It was a dangerous game with his own biology, a chemical Russian roulette played twice a day. That afternoon, he heard a car arrive. It wasn't the sound of Isabel's car. The tires were heavier, the engine more powerful. Shortly after she entered the study, not alone, she brought with her a man with a deep voice and heavy footsteps. "Please, have a seat, Dr. Albright," Isabel said. "My husband is here. As you can see, but he won't be interrupting us. He's in his own world most of the time." The condescension in her voice was a sharp knife. Arthur kept his face turned to the window, his muscles taut beneath his silk shirt. Through his half-closed eyelids, he could see the silhouette of a heavy-set man in a suit sitting in the armchair across from his desk. He opened a leather briefcase with a loud snap. "As we discussed, Mrs. Vance, I've brought the final documents for the liquidation of the Golden Valley Vineyards estate," the man said. His voice was devoid of emotion, the voice of someone used to turning memories into money. Arthur's heart stopped. Golden Valley Vineyards. It wasn't just an investment, it was his heritage, the Napa Valley winery where his father had taught him to distinguish grape varietals by the smell of the earth, where he had run free as a child. It was the first major deal he'd closed on his own, turning the small family operation into a renowned brand. It was the soul of his early fortune. "Excellent," Isabel said, her voice vibrating with ill-contained excitement. "Has the buyer made the initial deposit into the account I specified?" "Yes. As soon as we sign these, and with the power of attorney you hold, the transfer of the remaining capital will be executed within 48 hours. We got an excellent market price, a substantial profit. A profit. They were talking about profiting from the ashes of his history." Arthur felt the blood rush to his face, a wave of rage so intense he feared his body would betray him, that a tremor would give him away. He dug his nails into his palms, the pain anchoring him in his charade. He heard the sound of a pen gliding across paper. Isabel was signing. She was selling his past. The meeting lasted another 20 minutes, a torture of legal and financial terms that confirmed the systematic dismantling of his life. When Dr. Albright finally left, Isabel remained in the room. Arthur heard her walk up to him. She stood behind his chair, her hands resting on his shoulders. "It was a good day, my love," she whispered near his ear. "We're securing our future, getting rid of old burdens that no longer serve a purpose." He didn't answer. His mind was miles away, walking through the vineyards that no longer belonged to him. Isabel seemed to interpret his silence as his usual lethargy. She patted his shoulder, a gesture that was both affectionate and dismissive. She walked toward the door, but paused at the threshold as if remembering something. "You know," she said in a tone of casual confidence, "I was thinking about what to do next. The lake house in the Adirondacks holds so many memories, but they're old memories, and sad. I don't think Helen would mind if we sold it too, do you?" The name, Helen, his first wife, the woman he had loved with the passion of youth, and lost in a tragic car accident years before. Isabel, who had been his private nurse during his recovery, never mentioned her name. It was a forbidden subject, a wound too deep, and now she spoke of her with a chilling lightness, linking her memory to the sale of another piece of his soul. A coldness that had nothing to do with his blindness or confinement ran down his spine. Helen's accident. Suddenly, the tragedy that had defined his life took on a new, terrible shape in his mind. It wasn't just his future Isabel was stealing. He began to suspect she had stolen his past, too. The casual mention of Helen's name was like a key turning in a long rusted lock in Arthur's mind. His grief for Helen had been a dark ocean in which he had nearly drowned. Isabel, his nurse at the time, had been his lifeguard, her steady hand pulling him back to shore. He had seen her as a second chance at happiness, an unexpected gift from fate. Now, that narrative was crumbling. Her suggestion to sell the lake house, the sacred retreat he and Helen had built together, wasn't just insensitive, it was profane. It felt like a final cleansing, the erasure of the last evidence of a former life. The doubt, once planted, grew deep, venomous roots. Helen's accident. It had been on a back road, at night, in a torrential downpour. Her car had skidded off the road. There were no other witnesses. The authorities had ruled it a tragic fatality. He had never questioned it. Why would he? But now, in the light of Isabel's calculated cruelty, the accident seemed less an act of God and more an act of someone. Arthur felt himself sinking into a swamp of suspicion. He needed proof, something concrete, but he was isolated, a prisoner in his own home. His only connection to the truth was the little girl who played silently on his rug. His relationship with Leah had become his most precious secret. They developed a silent language. When Isabel wasn't around, he would open his eyes slightly. Leah understood. She would sit near him and speak in whispers, telling him about her day at school, her friends, her dreams. He, in turn, found ways to communicate. A slight nod, a raised finger for silence, a barely perceptible smile that she returned with a sparkle in her eyes. She was his little spy, his innocent eyes and ears in enemy territory. The sinister subplot he feared began to unfold. Isabel's campaign against Sophia and Leah intensified, becoming more dangerous. One day, as Sophia was cleaning the grand chandelier in the dining room, one of the steel cables mysteriously came loose, causing the heavy crystal structure to swing violently, missing her head by inches. Sophia screamed, terrified, clinging to the ladder. Isabel rushed in, not with concern but with a controlled fury. "This is the height of incompetence, Sophia. You could have destroyed an irreplaceable piece of art. And what if your daughter had been standing under here? Did you think of that?" The veiled threat was clear. Leah's safety was being used as a weapon. Arthur, listening from the hall, felt a primal fear. Isabel was capable of anything. A few days later, Leah was playing in the garden near the pool while her mother cleaned the upstairs rooms. Arthur was on the veranda, pretending to get some sun. He watched the girl, her colorful dress a spot of joy against the green lawn. He saw one of the heavy sliding glass doors leading to the pool begin to slide shut, slowly. There was no wind. Leah, her back to the door, was inches from its path. With his heart in his throat, Arthur did something he hadn't done in months. He pushed hard on the wheels of his chair, moving it a few inches forward, and deliberately knocked his water glass onto the stone floor. The sharp crack of shattering glass made Leah jump and turn. She saw the door sliding toward her and scrambled out of the way just in time. The heavy door slammed shut with a deafening boom. It had been a close call. Arthur knew with a chilling certainty that it had been no accident. Someone, hidden inside the house, had pushed that door. His relationship with Sophia changed as well. The housekeeper, initially just a functional presence, had become a central figure in his survival plan. He needed to warn her, to protect her. But how? One night, When Sophia brought him his dinner, Isabel was at a business dinner. Arthur sensed his chance. He knew Isabel had installed listening devices in parts of the house, a security precaution, she said. But his bedroom was his sanctuary, likely safe. "Sophia," he whispered as she placed the tray on his nightstand, "don't trust her. Watch your daughter. Strange things are happening in this house." Sophia looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise and fear. She had seen the accidents. She felt Isabel's hostility. His words were not a revelation, but a confirmation of her worst fears. "Mr. Vance, what is happening?" she whispered back, her voice trembling. He couldn't tell her everything, not yet. It was too dangerous for them both. "Just be careful," he said, "and please, don't leave Leah alone, not for a second." She nodded, terror etched on her face. The alliance was sealed. They were no longer just employer and employee. They were two prisoners in the same golden cell, trying to protect the only spark of innocence they had left. The silent alliance with Sophia brought Arthur a glimmer of hope, but also a new level of danger. Now he fought not only for his own freedom and fortune, but for the safety of a mother and her child. The mansion, with its silent hallways and vast rooms, had become a chessboard where every move had to be calculated. Isabel, perhaps sensing the subtle shift in dynamics, became even more oppressive. She hired 2 private security guards, burly men in dark suits with impassive faces, who were posted at the estate's entrances. The official justification was to protect Arthur from any external disturbances. The truth, he knew, was to create another layer to his prison, isolating him completely from the outside world. Any visitor had to be approved by her. His physical therapist, a kind man who visited 3 times a week, began to be chaperoned during their sessions. His phone calls were monitored. He was a billionaire under house arrest. His investigation into Helen's death became an obsession. Unable to access computers or files, he had to resort to his most powerful tool, his memory. During the long, sleepless nights, he reconstructed the days and weeks leading up to the accident. He remembered Helen complaining of constant headaches, of a fatigue that doctors couldn't explain. He remembered Isabel, then his nurse hired to help with a sports injury, being overly solicitous with Helen, preparing her calming herbal teas and insisting she needed more rest. A flashback, sharp and disturbing, assaulted him one afternoon. He was in his study, and Helen had come in, her face pale. "Arthur, I feel so strange, dizzy, like the world is spinning." Isabel had appeared right behind her, a cup in hand. "It's just your blood pressure, dear. Drink this tea. It will help you relax." He remembered the tea's strange, sweet smell, an aroma he'd never encountered before. Helen had drunk it obediently. A few hours later, she had insisted on driving to the pharmacy for a stronger painkiller, despite his protests. She never came back. The tea. Could it have been the tea? The idea was monstrous, something out of a pulp novel. But what if Isabel, meanwhile, continued to dismantle his empire? He would hear her on calls with stockbrokers, giving orders to sell massive blocks of shares in companies he'd spent decades building. His estate, his assets, were being liquidated, the money funneled into offshore funds and accounts whose names he'd never heard. She was erasing his financial identity, turning his solid wealth into an anonymous, untraceable cash flow. He was a ghost watching his own financial dismemberment. The tension in the house became unbearable. Isabel seemed constantly on the verge of exploding, her facade of the dedicated wife cracking under the pressure of her own scheme. Her primary targets remained Sophia and Leah. She began accusing Sophia of stealing small items, a pair of silver cufflinks, a gold pen. They were items Isabel would hide and then find in Sophia's belongings during humiliating inspections. The final straw was when Isabel confronted him directly about his inappropriate relationship with the housekeeper. "Arthur, I'm very worried about you," she said. her voice dripping with false compassion. "I've noticed how the presence of that woman and her child agitates you. They're filling your head with fantasies. The girl told me that you talk, that you smile at her. You know that's impossible, my love. You're unwell. They're taking advantage of your condition." He remained silent, his heart freezing over. She was building a narrative, the narrative that he was mentally unstable. "I spoke with Dr. Martins," she continued. "He agrees that perhaps a more controlled environment would be better for you, and for them. Perhaps an institution where they can get the help they need, to stop them from upsetting you." The threat was unmistakable. She was going to have them committed, him as an incapacitated mental patient, and Sophia and Leah as disruptive elements who were harming him. It was a masterstroke, a way to discredit anything they might say and remove them permanently from the equation. Time was running out. He had to act, and fast, before the walls of his mansion became the padded walls of an asylum. Isabel's threat hung in the air like a poisonous gas. An institution, the word echoed in Arthur's mind, a social death sentence, the final move to erase him from the world. She wasn't just going to steal his fortune, she was going to steal his sanity, his identity, and drag two innocent people into the abyss with him. The urgency turned to desperation. He didn't have weeks. He might not even have days. He had to find irrefutable proof. Something so powerful it could shatter Isabel's web of lies in a single blow. That night, when Sophia brought him his dinner, her hand trembled so much the silverware rattled on the tray. Her eyes were red, swollen from unshed tears. Isabel must have already made some new threat to her. As she leaned over to arrange the table, Arthur risked everything. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice so low it was almost a thought. "She's going to have us committed. Me, you, Leah." The color drained from Sophia's face. The terror in her eyes was absolute. What are we going to do?" His mind raced, searching the forgotten corners of the mansion, looking for a mistake, a loose thread in Isabel's perfect plan. And then a memory surfaced. A box, an old wooden box that had belonged to Isabel from her nursing days. He'd seen it once, years ago when they first moved into the mansion. She kept it in the back of a closet in the east guest room, a room that was never used. "In the guest room," he whispered. "In the closet, a dark wooden box. I need it. Wait until she leaves tomorrow. Bring it to me. Say you're doing a deep clean." The next day was an agony of waiting. Isabel left for a meeting with her lawyers, a meeting that, she claimed, was to finalize the protection of your estate. As soon as her car was out of the gates, Arthur heard Sophia's hurried footsteps upstairs. Every minute felt like an hour. He imagined her being discovered, the security guards being called. Finally, she returned, not with the box, but with a small, black, leather-bound book in her hand. "The box was locked," she whispered, breathless, handing him the book. "But this was inside, under a false bottom. It looks like a journal." She placed the book in his hands and left quickly, returning to her work so as not to arouse suspicion. The book was small, heavy. Arthur's hands trembled as he held it. He waited until the deep silence of the night, when everyone in the house was asleep, fighting the residual effects of the evening's eye drops. He forced his eyes to focus, the fog painfully receding. He opened the book. It wasn't a journal. It was a log, a nursing log, meticulous and cold. The first pages detailed his own treatment for his knee injury years ago. Then her name appeared, Helen. Isabel's handwriting was precise, clinical. Next to Helen's name was the name of a substance he didn't recognize, followed by dosages. 10 mg. H. Complained of headache. 50 mg. H. Reported dizziness and fatigue. The dates corresponded to the weeks leading up to her death. Day after day, the dose increased. Isabel's notes chronicled his wife's deterioration with chilling clarity. And 20 episode of mental confusion. 30 loss of balance. His blood ran cold. Helen hadn't been sick. She had been poisoned, systematically. He turned the page to the final entry, dated the day of the accident. His vision blurred with tears, but he forced himself to read. The handwriting was the same, calm and controlled, 40 min max dose, administered at 3 p.m. in T. Full effect expected within 2 to 3 hours. Driving not advised. Problem solved. Problem solved. 2 words that rewrote his entire life, his grief, his mourning, his second chance at love, all built on the pillar of a cold-blooded murder. The accident had been no accident. It was the climax of a slow, deliberate poisoning. The woman he had loved hadn't died. She had been executed, and the murderer was the woman sleeping in the next room, the guardian of his fortune, the executioner of his freedom. Helen's inheritance hadn't just been money. It was her place beside him, a place Isabel had coveted and taken by the cruelest force. A dry sob escaped his lips. The book fell into his lap. He wasn't married to a thief. He was married to a monster. And in that moment of absolute terror, he heard the soft sound of his bedroom doorknob beginning to turn. The sound of the turning doorknob was like the click of a hammer being cocked. In an instinctive motion born of pure terror, Arthur shoved the little black book under the blanket covering his legs. Seconds before the door swung open, he squeezed his eyes shut, forcing his face into the blank, passive mask that had become his second skin. His heart was a runaway drum, but his breathing, he forced it to be slow and even. The book, the physical proof of Isabel's absolute evil, burned against his skin through the thin fabric of his pajamas. Isabel's silhouette was framed against the dim light from the hallway. She moved with the lightness of a nocturnal predator. He sensed her approaching the bed. "Arthur, are you awake?" she whispered. Her voice was a sweet poison. The same voice, he now knew, that had whispered comforting words to Helen while serving her death in a teacup. He didn't move, feigning the deep sleep of the medicated. She stood beside the bed for a moment that felt like an eternity. He could feel her gaze on him, assessing. What was she looking for? A sign of betrayal? A flicker of awareness in his supposedly blind eyes? "You seemed restless," she continued, more to herself than to him. "Better make sure you rest soundly." He heard the familiar soft click, the eye drop bottle. She was going to administer an extra dose in the middle of the night. It was an act of total control, a way to ensure his darkness was absolute, even in his dreams. He felt her hand cup his chin, tilting his head back. He didn't resist. The cold drop fell, followed by the other. The milky haze spread instantly, robbing him of what little sight he'd managed to reclaim, plunging him back into total blackness. It was his punishment for having seen the truth. Isabel stood for another moment, then seemed satisfied. He heard her walk away and softly close the door. Alone, Arthur let out the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His body trembled violently, a delayed reaction to the shock and fear. He clutched the book under the blanket. This was no longer just about his fortune, his business, his assets. It was about justice for Helen. It was about survival. The threat of the institution was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The doctor's report, the fabricated mental instability, it was all part of the same plan that had begun with a poisoned cup of tea years ago. Isabel didn't leave loose ends. He needed a way to expose her that was undeniable, that would bypass her lawyers, her bought doctors, and her public image as a devoted wife. The idea came to him in the darkness, a desperate spark. Recordings. He needed her to confess. He needed to get her to talk about her plans, about Helen, about the money. But how? He was confined to a chair and a bed. And then he thought of Leah, his little spy, a child who moved through the house with a freedom he would never have again, a child whom Isabel, in her arrogance, saw as an insignificance. It was a monstrous risk, to use a child to put her in the path of a monster. But the alternative was the destruction of them all. The next morning, he was ready. When Sophia came in to collect his breakfast tray, he waited for Isabel's footsteps to fade down the hall. "Sophia," he whispered, the urgency making his voice hoarse. "We have no time. She's going to make her move soon. I need your help. I need Leah's help." He explained his plan in quick, feverish whispers. Recording devices. Small, easy to hide. He knew he had some from his previous life, tucked away in a desk drawer Isabel had never opened. He described to Sophia exactly where they were. Leah would have to plant them, one behind the orchid planter in the living room, one under Isabel's favorite armchair in the study, and the most important one, under the nightstand in her bedroom. Sophia's face was a mask of terror. "Mr. Vance, Leah is just a child. If she catches her—" "She won't catch her," Arthur insisted, his voice gaining a strength that surprised them both. "Isabel underestimates her. She underestimates all of us. It's our only advantage. It's our only chance. Fight with us, Sophia." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, but she nodded, her loyalty overriding her fear. Later that day, while Arthur sat in his study, he heard Isabel on the phone. Her voice was crisp and final. "Yes, it's all confirmed for tomorrow morning. The ambulance will arrive at 9 o'clock sharp. The papers are all signed. No fuss, no scandal, just a smooth transition. He won't be in any position to protest." Arthur's blood ran cold. Tomorrow morning, he didn't have days. He had hours. His last night of freedom would be spent feigning blindness, while a brave little girl became his only hope of seeing the next day's light. The night fell on the mansion like a shroud. For Arthur, every sound was magnified, every second stretched to the breaking point. The ambulance would arrive at 9 a.m. This was his last chance, the final desperate play in a game where his life and Helen's were the stakes. The weight of his decision to involve Leah was crushing, but the thought of the girl's innocence being threatened gave him a fierce strength. His little spy had to succeed. Isabel was strangely calm at dinner, a chilling serenity that could only come from the certainty of victory. She talked about plans to redecorate the study, to turn Arthur's dark, masculine space into something lighter, more airy. She spoke as if he were already gone, and in a way, he was. The man she saw was a shell, a sham. The real Arthur was plotting, praying, placing his entire faith in a 6-year-old child. After helping him to bed, Isabel administered the eye drops with an almost ceremonial care. "Sleep well, my love," she said, her voice a satisfied purr. "Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of our lives." The irony was so sharp, Arthur almost choked. He waited. 1 hour, 2. The house was utterly silent. Then he heard the softest sound. The nearly inaudible creak of a floorboard in the hall. It was Sophia, fulfilling her part of the plan, distracting the security guards with a problem in the laundry room. And then an even lighter sound. His door opening a crack. Leah slipped into the room like a tiny ghost. Barefoot in her pajamas, she clutched the tiny recording devices in her hand, just as he had described. Arthur, in his chemically induced darkness, could only rely on his hearing. He heard her soft breath, her careful little steps on the rug. She moved into the study, an annex to his bedroom, first. He heard the nearly silent sound of Velcro being pressed under the armchair. One down, she came back into the main bedroom. The next target was Isabel's nightstand, just feet from where the woman slept. Arthur's heart pounded so hard he was afraid the sound would wake her. He heard Leah crawling across the floor. He heard her hold her breath. Time stopped. A tiny click. The second device was in place. He sensed her approaching his bed. She needed to plant the third device, the one that would record him, in case Isabel came in to speak to him before the ambulance arrived. He felt her small hand touch the wooden frame of his bed, a tiny scrape. It was done. She was safe. But as she drew back, Leah's foot brushed against one of the shoes Isabel had left on the floor. A soft, muffled sound. But in the stillness of the night, it sounded like a thunderclap. In the bed, Isabel stirred. Arthur held his breath. Leah froze. He heard the rustle of sheets. Isabel sat up. "Who's there?" Her voice was groggy, but alert. The silence was absolute. Arthur could feel Leah's terror, a wave of panic radiating in the dark. She was trapped. "I heard something," Isabel said, now fully awake. He heard the click of her bedside lamp. Light flooded the room. Arthur knew he had to do something, anything to draw attention away from the little girl hidden in the shadow of his bed. With a monumental effort, he rolled over, letting out a loud, anguished groan as if in the throes of a nightmare. "No, Helen, no!" he mumbled. The words a rehearsed sob loaded with genuine pain. Isabel's attention snapped to him instantly. "Arthur, Arthur, wake up!" She got out of bed and came to his side. Her shadow fell over the area where Leah was hiding, giving the girl the perfect cover to crawl silently out of the room. Isabel shook his shoulder. "It was just a nightmare, my love. It's all right." Arthur opened his blind eyes and turned his face toward her, his expression of confusion and fear perfectly staged. "Isabel, I had a terrible dream about Helen. It felt so real." His gambit worked, but in a way he hadn't expected. A strange expression crossed Isabel's face. It wasn't compassion, it was irritation, mixed with a cruel, triumphant edge. "Ah, Helen," she said, and her voice lost all its sweetness. It turned cold, hard as steel. "Always Helen. Even now she's between us, isn't she? But don't you worry. Tomorrow you'll go to a place where all those painful memories will just fade away." She thought he was a broken man, delirious. This was the moment. The recording device under his bed was capturing everything. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. Isabel laughed, a low, ugly sound. "I mean, the problem will finally be solved, just like I solved the problem of Helen. She was an obstacle, just like your memory of her is now. She was weak, sick. I just hurried the inevitable. And tomorrow, I will finally be able to take care of our estate, our future, without the burden of your past." It was more than he could have hoped for. It was a confession, cold, unequivocal, and recorded. His victory was here, inches away, but as he looked at her face, illuminated by the soft lamplight, he saw something that chilled his blood more than the confession itself. In her eyes, there wasn't just cruelty. There was a glimmer of recognition. She wasn't just confessing to a delirious husband. There was something in her gaze that made him realize, with absolute terror, that she knew. She knew he wasn't asleep. She knew he was listening, and she was enjoying it. The glimmer in Isabel's eyes was the final, most terrible piece of the puzzle. She hadn't been fooled by his act. Somehow, at some point, she had found out. Her confession wasn't an arrogant slip. It was a declaration of victory, a final psychological torture for the man she was about to destroy. She wanted him to know, in his darkness, exactly how complete his defeat was. The game he thought he was playing in the shadows had already been lost in the light. "You're a better actor than I gave you credit for, Arthur," she said, her voice now stripped of all pretense, pure and glacial. "Your eyes, it was the girl, wasn't it? That little pest. I should have fired them the first day." Arthur's blood ran cold. She knew everything. His fear for Leah and Sophia was a suffocating wave. "But it doesn't matter now," Isabel continued, straightening her silk nightgown. "The recording? A clever idea. But who's going to believe a man who is about to be declared mentally incompetent in a few hours? It's my word, the word of a devoted, long-suffering wife against a sick man's—" She walked to her nightstand, picked up her cell phone, and dialed a number. "Hello? Yes, I want to move up the time. Come now, the situation here has become unstable." His plan had crumbled. The ambulance was on its way. He had the evidence, but he was about to be silenced forever. In that moment of absolute desperation, he remembered something. Years ago, for his personal safety, He had installed a silent panic button under the headboard of his bed, wired directly to the local police precinct. He had never used it. Isabel, in her meticulous takeover, had never discovered it. As she stood with her back to him, talking on the phone, Arthur slid his hand slowly, painfully, under his pillow. His fingers searched for the small plastic nub. There it was. With the last ounce of his strength, he pressed it. There was no sound, no light, just a silent click of hope in the darkness. "Yes, bring the full team," Isabel was saying. "He's becoming aggressive." She hung up and turned to him with a triumphant smile. "The game is over. Arthur." The next few minutes were the longest of his life. He could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. Were they for him? Or was it Isabel's ambulance? The mansion's doorbell rang, shrill and insistent. Isabel frowned. "They're fast." She left the room. Arthur heard her voice in the hall, speaking to the security guards. "Open the gate. It's the ambulance I called for." But the voice that answered from the other side of the door was not a paramedic's. It was a firm, authoritative voice. "Police, we have a panic alert from this residence. Please open the door." The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur heard Isabel's hurried steps returning to the bedroom. Her face was a mask of fury and disbelief. "What did you do?" she hissed. In that moment, everything happened at once. The police, not waiting for an invitation, forced their way in. The sound of doors being thrown open echoed through the house. Sophia, who had been hiding with Leah in a service room, came running out to meet the officers, crying and pointing toward the master bedroom. 2 uniformed police officers entered the room, their serious expressions taking in the scene. The elegant, furious woman, the helpless-looking man in the bed. "Is everything all right in here, sir?" one of them asked, addressing Arthur. And for the first time in months, Arthur let the charade fall away. He sat up in bed, the movement startling everyone in the room. He looked directly at Isabel, and his eyes, now perfectly focused, held no fear, only a cold justice. "No, officer," he said, his voice clear and strong. "Nothing is all right." He reached toward his nightstand. "On this cell phone, which belongs to my wife, you will find recordings made tonight. Recordings in which she confesses to poisoning my first wife, Helen, and details her plan to have me forcibly committed to steal my estate." He pointed to the small recorder Leah had planted. "The proof is right here." Isabel's face contorted into a snarl of hatred. She lunged forward, trying to grab the devices. But the second officer was faster, restraining her. The fight was over. The truth, brought to light by a love from the past and the courage of a child, was stronger than any lie. As the officers read Isabel her rights, her gaze met Arthur's. Her expression wasn't one of remorse. It was of pure, cold contempt. Arthur's first victory was reclaiming his vision, not just the physical, but the clarity to see the truth of years of deception. When Sophia entered the room, leading Leah by the hand, he looked at them, his real family, forged in the fire of adversity. His empire of money, stocks and assets seemed insignificant compared to the wealth of loyalty and love he saw in their eyes. He had regained control, not just of his business, but of his life, and that was the only return on investment that truly mattered. 5 weeks. It felt like a lifetime. 5 weeks since the morning a child's finger had removed the scales from his eyes, freeing him from a darkness far deeper than the physical. The study, once his gilded cell, was now flooded with late afternoon sunlight. The scent of lemon pledge still hung in the air, but it was no longer the smell of his prison. It was the scent of a clean home, of a new beginning. The legal proceedings had been swift and devastating for Isabel. The recordings, corroborated by the nursing log and an exhumation that revealed traces of the poison in Helen's remains, painted an irrefutable picture of calculated cruelty. The fraudulent financial transactions, the hasty sale of assets, and the transfer of capital to secret accounts were the final proof. Isabel, the woman who had planned to live in luxury on a stolen fortune, received a sentence that would put her behind bars for decades. Justice for Helen was finally served, a solemn peace that settled in Arthur's heart. Reclaiming his empire was a more complex battle, fought in boardrooms and courtrooms. Lawyers voided contracts, reversed sales, and traced his assets through tax havens. Slowly, piece by piece, he rebuilt his estate. But something had changed. The glow of dividends and the rise of stocks no longer brought him the same satisfaction. His time in the darkness had taught him the true value of things: loyalty, courage, a simple act of kindness. His greatest victory, however, was not financial. It was physical and emotional. With the help of a new physical therapist, free from Isabel's surveillance, he dedicated himself to his recovery with the same iron will he had used to build his fortune. Months of forced muscle atrophy were fought with hours of painful exercises. First, he managed to wiggle his toes, then to stand, trembling, supported by parallel bars. And then, one day, he took his first step. Now, he stood by the large study window, looking out at the garden. He was no longer confined to a wheelchair. He could walk, slowly, with the help of an elegant cane, but he walked. He was free. The sound of childish laughter caught his attention. He turned and smiled. Leah, now officially his adopted daughter, was sitting on the Persian rug, building a tower with wooden blocks. Sophia, who had become the house manager and his closest confidant, watched her with an affectionate smile. They were his family. The adoption process had been the most important investment of his life, an application whose return was paid in pure love and joy. "The tower is going to reach the sky, Daddy," Leah announced, placing the final block with intense concentration. "Daddy." The word still filled his heart with a warmth no amount of wealth could buy. He walked over and sat on the floor beside her, a feat that would have been unthinkable a few weeks ago. "It's the tallest tower I've ever seen," he said, the admiration in his voice completely genuine. Sophia came over with a cup of tea. "Be careful not to overdo it, Arthur." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I've never been better in my life." The mansion, which had witnessed years of deceit and pain, had been transformed into a sanctuary of healing and happiness. Arthur, the tycoon who had lived in an artificial darkness, had discovered that sometimes you have to pretend to be blind to finally see the truth. Leah, the little girl who just wanted to clean someone's eyes, had become the light that illuminated years of shadowy manipulation. And Sophia, the loyal mother who never stopped doing what was right, had found a safe home and an unexpected love. As he looked at the tower of colored blocks, a reflection of the bright future they were building together, Arthur understood the final truth. His greatest fortune wasn't held in banks or invested in Bitcoin and gold. It wasn't measured in dollars, euros, or net worth. His true wealth, his most precious treasure, was right there, sitting on the floor beside him, laughing as the tower inevitably tumbled down, ready to be built again, stronger and taller than before.